A raise. You should be thankful we even keep you. Victor chuckled, his voice echoing across the conference room walls. I remained completely still in my seat, the quarterly performance review folder open before me. 7 years of stellar evaluations. 7 years without a single salary adjustment. Penny, your request is… Diane. The CFO tilted her head with exaggerated sympathy. Bold, considering market conditions. The leadership team traded knowing looks around the table. 8 people who collectively decided my value. People who understood nothing about what I actually contributed. I created the calibration method that boosted our precision by 37%, I said, keeping my voice firm. Production time was reduced by half. The Eastbrook contract, which we secured through assertive negotiation, was due to sales strategy, interrupted Ben, VP of Sales, though we both knew it was my technical parameters that sealed that deal. I've mentored 16 junior technicians since joining. I've personally resolved critical issues for key clients. The European expansion would have failed if I hadn't… Team effort, Victor cut in, tapping his fingers on the polished table. Everyone contributes here, Penny. Your salary hasn't shifted since you were hired. I'm only asking to match current industry standards. Victor leaned back, exchanging amused smirks with the others. Industry standards apply to average performers. If you want exceptional pay, deliver exceptional outcomes. My chest tightened. The calibration breakthrough I'd pioneered had generated millions. Last quarter's report, one I wasn't meant to see, credited a 28% profit surge directly to proprietary technical enhancements. The numbers are clear, I said, sliding market research forward. Engineers with my skill set and output earn at least 30% more. Victor didn't even glance at my carefully prepared papers. He simply nudged them back. A raise? You should be grateful we still employ you. The VP laughed during my review. The entire leadership team nodded along. I rose, placed an envelope on the table, and said, "Thank you for your time." 3 days later, when they discovered where I was headed, the frantic calls began flooding my phone. If you're still watching, you know exactly how it feels when people who profit from your brilliance dismiss your value. Hit that like button if you've ever been underappreciated, and subscribe to hear the rest, because what comes next reshaped an entire industry. My name is Penelope Wright, Penny to most, and until 3 weeks ago, I served as the lead calibration engineer at Midwest Manufacturing Specialists. Not that you'd know that from my job title, which remained technical specialist too, despite my responsibilities increasing every single year. I grew up dismantling every appliance in our home, much to my parents' frustration. At 12, I could reassemble a vacuum cleaner with improved suction. At 16, I upgraded my school's instruments to achieve readings far beyond their budget. My engineering professors in college called me Precision Penny, a nickname that carried into my professional career. When I joined Midwest, I felt thankful for the chance. The company produced industrial equipment for industries ranging from aerospace to medical tech. My starting pay seemed reasonable for a recent graduate, and the promise of advancement kept me motivated through long days and intense assignments. The calibration innovation came during my second year. For months, I noticed inconsistencies in our testing machinery, tiny deviations others brushed off as acceptable variance. But in precision manufacturing, those margins marked the line between greatness and mediocrity. I spent weekends testing alternative approaches using my own tools, purchased slowly from my modest paycheck. The breakthrough hit me at 3 a.m. A hybrid technique integrating digital measurements with mechanical micro-adjustments in a sequence no one had attempted. When I showcased my method to the engineering team, the impact was immediate. Accuracy skyrocketed while calibration time dropped from 6 hours to under 3. The production floor adopted the technique within a week, and suddenly, our products surpassed every competitor in accuracy testing. Orders surged, complaints vanished. Client retention hit 100% for the first time in company history. I waited for recognition, a promotion, a bonus, anything, even a mention in the company newsletter. Instead, in the quarterly meeting, my innovation was presented as our proprietary method, with no credit to me. Victor answered questions from impressed board members while I sat quietly in the back row. This is how business works, my coworker Hammy told me afterward. Individual credit isn't how you move up here. Be patient. So I was patient. I trained new hires on my calibration technique, documenting every detail so production wouldn't collapse during my rare sick days. I answered client calls at midnight when their equipment demanded emergency adjustments. The European expansion arrived in my 5th year. Regulatory standards differed drastically from American guidelines, and the first shipment of machines failed inspection spectacularly. The expansion team spiraled into crisis, with millions in equipment sitting useless in warehouses. Penny, we need solutions, not explanations, Victor said during the emergency meeting. Either fix this, or we'll find someone who can. I canceled plans for the next 6 weekends. My relationship with Louise ended when I missed his sister's wedding. I reworked essential components, updated testing procedures, and created calibration standards tailored for European regulations. By the 7th week, our machines passed inspection, with scores surpassing local manufacturers. The company celebrated the expansion with a party I couldn't attend. I was on a video call with German technicians, guiding them through implementation. Each year, my reviews praised my commitment and technical mastery. Each year, my pay remained unchanged. When I brought it up, I was told the company was restructuring, consolidating resources, or emphasizing team recognition over individual contributions. I watched newer employees, usually men with half my experience, negotiate starting salaries higher than mine after 6 years. That's just how negotiation works, HR said when I asked. Your performance is valued, but we can't disrupt internal equity by adjusting established employees. So I stopped asking and began applying elsewhere. Offers arrived quickly. My reputation in the industry had grown despite the company's attempts to brand my innovations as collective achievements. I rejected 3 offers out of misplaced loyalty before an unexpected email landed in my inbox. Your calibration method has transformed equipment precision standards, wrote Olivia, director of the Industrial Certification Authority. We're creating a new role, Chief Innovation Officer, to modernize certification protocols across the industry. Based on your impact, we'd like to discuss your interest. The ACA sets the standards every manufacturer must meet. Their certification determines whether companies thrive or collapse. The offer included compensation that made my current salary look like an accounting mistake, plus authority to shape industry-wide practices. I met Olivia for dinner, expecting only to gather information. 3 hours later, surrounded by empty plates and pages of notes on potential improvements, I realized I'd found my next direction. I need 2 weeks to transition my current projects, I told her as we left. Take the time you need, she said. We've waited years for someone with your vision. A few more weeks won't matter. I decided to give Midwest one final chance. I prepared extensive documentation of my contributions, market salary comparisons, and a modest request, still below industry value, but acknowledging my worth. I scheduled my annual review early and arrived hopeful that logic might prevail. Instead, I received laughter and dismissal. As I walked back to my workstation, a strange calm washed over me. 7 years of uncertainty about my value evaporated instantly. Their reaction wasn't a tactic. It was the truth of how they viewed me, disposable despite being indispensable. I sent a short email accepting Olivia's offer before starting my afternoon tasks. That night, I wrote my resignation letter. 2 paragraphs, professional and direct. I listed no grievances and made no accusations. I simply stated I'd be leaving in 2 weeks to pursue another opportunity and would transition all projects properly. I slipped the letter into an envelope and placed it in my bag for the next day. My phone lit up with a text from Jamie. "How'd the review go?" I stared at it for a long moment before replying, "Exactly as expected." The next morning, I arrived at work as usual. I greeted security, set up my workstation, and handled urgent client issues. At precisely 9:30, I walked to the conference room where leadership held their daily briefing. I knocked once and entered. 8 pairs of eyes turned toward me, mildly puzzled. "Penny, we're in the middle of something," Victor said, irritated by the interruption. I stepped forward silently and placed the envelope at the center of the table. "Thank you for your time," I said, then walked out, closing the door behind me. The envelope stayed untouched for 3 days. I kept working, documenting procedures and training coworkers on tasks only I knew how to handle. No one acknowledged my unexpected appearance at the leadership meeting. No one asked about the envelope. On the third day, while calibrating equipment for our newest client, my phone started vibrating nonstop in my pocket. 6 missed calls from HR, 4 from Victor, 2 from Diane. I powered it off and completed the calibration. What unfolded next would transform not only my future, but the industry's entire standards of competence and accountability. And it all began with that simple, unopened envelope. When I returned to my desk, Heather from HR was waiting. "Penny," she whispered, "Victor read your letter. He's concerned. Can we talk privately?" I followed her into a small conference room where Victor and Diane were already seated. Victor slid my resignation letter toward me. "What is this?" he asked, as if the clearly written notice were indecipherable. "My 2 weeks' notice," I said. "I've accepted another position." "Where?" Diane snapped. "I'd rather not discuss that until I start," I replied. Victor leaned forward, his tone shifting from yesterday's condescension to today's urgency. "Penny, perhaps we were a bit rash during your review. Let's reconsider your compensation request." "The leadership team was having a tough day," Heather added. "We value your work immensely." "I appreciate that," I said, "but I've already accepted another offer." "Whatever they're paying, we'll match it," Diane insisted. I thought about 7 years of rejected requests, of watching underqualified colleagues move ahead while I stayed stagnant, of weekend overtime and midnight troubleshooting, of breakthroughs credited to the company rather than to me. "This isn't about money," I said, though admittedly it partly was. "It's about choosing the right path for my growth." "We can create a new role," Victor offered. "Senior technical specialist with your own team." "Thank you, but my decision is final." Their offers escalated rapidly, as if they were bargaining with a hostage negotiator. By the time I left the room, they'd promised a 50% raise, a director title, and a seat on the innovation committee, the same committee that had rejected my proposals for years. I refused every offer with growing clarity. The next 2 weeks felt surreal. Colleagues who barely acknowledged me suddenly wanted to eat lunch. Executives who never remembered my name appeared at my desk with technical questions that revealed how little they understood our products. I documented everything in detail: calibration steps, troubleshooting techniques, client-specific adjustments. I created training materials for systems I had managed alone. I condensed 7 years of knowledge into clean, organized files accessible to anyone. On my last day, I handed my projects to 3 different engineers, each taking a share of my duties. My desk, always minimal, took less than 10 minutes to empty. Victor approached as I signed final paperwork with HR. "This is a mistake, Penny," he said, trailing me toward the exit. "You're throwing away 7 years of building your career here." I stopped at security and returned my badge. Those 7 years gave me experience I'm grateful for. "At least tell us where you're going," he pressed as we entered the lobby. "We should stay in touch." I considered a dozen answers before giving him the simplest truth. "The Industrial Certification Authority. Today is my last day here, but I don't start there for 3 weeks. I'm taking some time off." His face blanched. The ICA? In what role? Chief Innovation Officer. Victor's expression crumpled into something between fear and disbelief. He knew, as everyone in the industry did, that the ICA determined which products reached market and which ones failed. Their certification process could propel or destroy a company's future. His voice dropped to a whisper. We should talk about this. We've had 7 years to talk, I replied. Goodbye, Victor. I stepped through the glass doors into bright spring sunlight, the weight of unappreciated years lifting with each step toward my car. Those 3 weeks between jobs were the first real break I'd taken since college. I visited my parents in Michigan, hiked trails I'd never had time to explore, and slept without setting an alarm. I ignored 14 calls from various Midwest manufacturing numbers and deleted their voicemails without listening. On my first day at the ICA, Olivia personally walked me to my office. An actual office, with windows and a door, not the shared workstation I'd occupied for 7 long years. The certification standards hadn't been meaningfully revised in nearly a decade, she explained. Technology had advanced, yet our requirements hadn't kept up. Your first assignment is to update our approach, especially in precision measurement protocols. I spent my first month studying the organization, reviewing existing standards, and pinpointing outdated requirements. By the 6th week, I prepared initial revisions that would elevate industry expectations to match current technological capability. These are considerable changes, Xavier, the technical review director remarked during our planning session. Some manufacturers will have trouble meeting them. Any manufacturer already using proper best practices will satisfy these requirements, I responded. The updates mainly affect those relying on obsolete methods or cutting corners like neglecting calibration drift over time, Xavier asked. Exactly like that, I said, recalling how Midwest routinely stretched recalibration intervals to cut expenses, a habit I had repeatedly warned was potentially hazardous. The standards update process involved 3 months of detailed work, peer evaluations, and industry consultations. Throughout, I adhered to strict professional ethics, never singling out specific manufacturers or creating rules that favored particular companies. The revised standards simply represented what was genuinely achievable with modern precision technology I had personally demonstrated years before. When the new standards were released, my phone rang within hours. Penny, it's Jamie from Midwest. Have you seen what the A just published? I wrote what the A just published, I answered. These precision demands, the calibration timelines, they're impossible. They aren't impossible. I instituted similar standards at Midwest 3 years ago, but they were never officially adopted because of cost objections. Silence stretched over the line before Jamie spoke again. Our certification renewal is next month. We're nowhere close to compliant with these new requirements. The A provides implementation guidance for companies transitioning to the updated standards, I said, repeating our official position. I can connect you with that department if you'd prefer. Jaime declined. I later learned Midwest had contracted an outside consultant at premium pricing. 2 weeks later, my assistant informed me Midwest Manufacturing had requested an urgent pre-assessment review, a service we offered for companies uncertain about their certification standing. The review was assigned to one of our senior inspectors, keeping my professional distance from my previous employer. The inspector's report arrived on my desk with a prominent red flag alert. Midwest's equipment failed to meet the updated standards by wide margins. Their calibration practices were antiquated, their precision measurements inconsistent, and their quality control documentation insufficient. I forwarded the report to our certification committee with routine recommendations for improvement paths. No special treatment, positive or negative, simply the facts. 3 days later, Victor called my direct line. Penny, he began without greeting. We need to talk about these new certification requirements. All communication regarding certification must go through official channels, I replied. The implementation team can help with your transition plan. This isn't about implementation, he snapped. These standards are obviously crafted to target our processes specifically. This feels personal. The standards apply fairly to all manufacturers in the sector, I said. Plenty of companies are already compliant. Others are successfully adapting. You know exactly what you're doing, he accused. You're using your position to punish us for not giving you that raise. I let his words hang briefly. Victor, I'm recording this call per ICA policy for all certification discussions. Would you like to rephrase your statement for the record? He disconnected. Midwest's formal certification review became due while I was presenting at an international standards conference in Vienna. The committee reviewed their application without my involvement, following our established procedures. Their conclusion: provisional certification only, with mandatory compliance checks every 30 days until full standards were satisfied. In industry terms, this was a substantial setback. Provisional certification carried restrictions on new contracts and required disclosure to existing clients about compliance status. For a company that previously enjoyed automatic renewals, due largely to my behind-the-scenes corrections prior to official inspections, this was both a practical and reputational ordeal. When I returned, I found 27 messages from various Midwest executives, rising in urgency and desperation. I answered with a single email, directing all certification questions to our official channels, copying our ethics officer for transparency. The industry summit 6 months later emphasized how drastically standards had shifted. My keynote on precision requirements for next-generation manufacturing drew attendees from 4 continents. In the front row sat Midwest's leadership team, including Victor and Diane, taking notes with the intense focus of students before a major exam. During the networking reception afterward, Ben from Midwest approached me, champagne glass in hand but sobriety in his expression. "Impressive presentation," he said. "We've brought on 3 specialists to implement the new standards, but progress is difficult. Quality improvement is always a process," I replied calmly. "We've invested nearly $7 million in equipment upgrades," he added. "Ironically, these were the same upgrades you requested in your final budget proposal with us." I took a slow sip of my water, offering no response. "The thing is," Ben lowered his voice slightly, "we're still having trouble with the calibration protocol. The documentation you left behind wasn't fully complete." "The documentation was fully comprehensive for the procedures used at that time," I corrected him. "The updated standards demand different methods you originally pioneered," he noted. "Look, Victor wants to meet with you privately to explore consulting opportunities." I kept my professional smile steady. "I see as staff are forbidden from private consulting with organizations we certify. That would constitute a conflict of interest." "He's prepared to make it worth your time," Ben pushed. "That would be illegal," I stated sharply, "and this conversation is veering into inappropriate territory." As I turned to walk away, he caught my arm. "You don't get it. Without full certification by the end of this quarter, we lose the Eastbrook contract. That's nearly 30% of our yearly revenue." I removed his hand gently. "Then I suggest you direct your efforts toward meeting the standards instead of trying to circumvent them." As I continued down the hallway, Diane intercepted me near the exhibition hall doors. "Penny," she began with an overly sweet tone, "you look lovely. This new role clearly suits you." "Thank you," I responded calmly. "If you'll excuse me, I need to moderate a panel." "Just one moment," she insisted. "We've been restructuring at Midwest, forming a new division centered on precision technology advancement. The board has approved a remarkable compensation package for the right leader." I met her eyes directly. "Are you offering me a position, Diane?" "We're exploring possibilities with someone who understands our specific challenges, someone who could help us satisfy the new certification requirements, someone who grasps the practical realities of implementation timelines," she countered. I smiled politely. I believe the ICA's implementation guidelines already offer realistic timelines for companies genuinely committed to quality improvements, companies capable of surviving those timelines, she muttered. The comment lingered between us, revealing more than she intended. Midwest wasn't just struggling, they were in real danger. If Midwest manufacturing cannot meet modern industry standards, I said carefully, perhaps there are deeper operational issues that need attention beyond certification itself. Her polite facade wavered. You know exactly what you're doing to us. Applying the same standards to every manufacturer that I apply to myself, I replied. Yes, I know exactly what I'm doing. As I continued walking, Victor appeared from a side corridor, stepping forward to block my path. His once confident stride had weakened into something almost hesitant. His expression carried the exhaustion of months spent resisting the unavoidable. 2 minutes, he said quietly. That's all I'm asking. Against my judgment, I paused. We made a terrible mistake, he admitted, dropping his voice. Would you consider consulting for us? Name your rate. I studied the man who had mocked my request for fair compensation after years of work, who had taken credit for my advancements while denying me opportunities, who now stood before me not as a commanding executive, but as someone desperate for rescue. I'm afraid I'm quite satisfied with my current position, I replied, echoing the dismissive words he once used in my performance review. As I stepped past him toward the panel room, he called after me. This isn't over, Penny. I turned briefly. You're right about that, Victor. For Midwest manufacturing, this is only beginning. What I couldn't tell him, what I couldn't tell anyone, was that the true reckoning had not yet arrived. Because although updating industry standards had created turmoil for my former employer, those revisions were never about revenge. They were simply overdue improvements that elevated the entire sector. My real plan was only now entering its final stage. The ethics panel on technical innovation was my last official duty at the summit. As experts debated the boundary between proprietary techniques and shared industry standards, I noticed Victor slipping out of the auditorium, phone pressed to his ear, face tight with worry. 2 weeks later, industry news announced that Midwest Manufacturing had secured an emergency loan to finance strategic upgrades. Reading between the lines, they were burning cash in a last-ditch effort to meet certification rules before losing their biggest contracts. Back at ICEA headquarters, my team had already moved into the second stage of our standards modernization, transparent attribution protocols. This new system would require companies to properly credit technical breakthroughs to their original creators, both to honor individual contributions and to establish clear lines of intellectual ownership. The patent system already handles that, argued one board member during the proposal review. Patents are costly, time-consuming, and often impractical for process innovations, I explained. Many breakthroughs are created by employees without the resources to file patents, while companies claim these advances as proprietary without recognizing their developers. After 3 hours of debate, the board approved the initiative with one significant adjustment. It would launch as a voluntary certification edition for the first year, becoming mandatory in the second. Companies need time to adapt their documentation procedures, the board chair said. This gives them a transition period while still rewarding early adopters. Perfect. The voluntary phase would actually advance my goals even more effectively than a mandatory rollout. That evening, as I was getting ready to leave, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Penny, got a minute? Jaime stood in my doorway looking uneasy, dressed in formal clothes instead of the casual outfits we used to wear at Midwest. Jaime, what are you doing here? I interviewed with your implementation team this morning, she said. They offered me a position starting next month. I motioned toward a chair. Congratulations, but why would you leave Midwest? You were there longer than I ever was. Jaime's expression hardened. Everything changed after you left. They brought in consultants who blame everyone except leadership for the certification failures. 3 senior engineers were fired last week for supposedly failing to maintain technical standards. Not shocking, I said, but still disappointing. There's more, Jaime continued, leaning in. They've been digging through your old files, accusing you of intentionally sabotaging documentation before you left. Victor told the board you engineered the new standards specifically to damage Midwest. I gave a faint smile. And yet, they've offered me jobs and consulting deals multiple times since I walked out. Desperation makes people contradictory. She shrugged. But look, I'm not here just about the job. I thought you should know they're drafting a formal complaint against you, alleging a conflict of interest in the standards development process. My smile grew. Are they really? Jaime studied my face. You don't look worried. Because I've done absolutely nothing improper, I replied. Every stage of our standards work was documented, peer-reviewed, and authorized through the proper channels. My prior history with Midwest was disclosed and managed appropriately. They're saying you used proprietary information that you're now using against them. The certification standards contain nothing exclusive to Midwest, I said. They reflect industry best practices that dozens of manufacturers already follow successfully. Jaime nodded slowly. That's what I suspected. But they're desperate. The Eastbrook contract is hanging by a thread, and 3 more major clients are reconsidering their partnerships. When Jaime left for her orientation meeting, I weighed the implications. A formal complaint might be inconvenient, but ultimately advantageous. It would trigger exactly the level of scrutiny I had been preparing for with great patience. The next morning, I received official notice that Midwest Manufacturing had indeed filed a complaint with the A's Ethics Committee and the Industry Oversight Board. They accused me of weaponizing insider knowledge and manipulating certification requirements to target specific operational methods used at Midwest. I forwarded the complaint to our legal department with a short message. Proceeding as expected, please initiate Protocol 37. Protocol 37 was our standard defense procedure for certification disputes, a full audit of all documentation related to standards development, including every draft, comment, and revision. It usually took 3 weeks and produced hundreds of pages supporting our methodology. Over the next month, I continued my duties while the ethics inquiry unfolded. I made no public statements about Midwest, maintained strict professionalism, and concentrated on our new attribution framework. 3 manufacturing leaders approached me seeking early adoption of the attribution standards, eager to brand themselves as ethical pioneers. I collaborated closely with their teams to establish voluntary certification processes that would later become industry templates. 6 weeks after submitting their complaint, Midwest requested an emergency session with the ICA board. As Chief Innovation Officer, I was invited but recused myself due to the open investigation. Instead, I prepared a comprehensive brief for the board and watched the meeting via closed circuit from my office. Victor led Midwest's presentation, accompanied by their legal team and 2 outside consultants. Gone was the frantic man I had seen at the summit. Today he projected a polished outrage. The new standards are technically valid, he admitted. But the implementation timeline is punitive and appears aimed at certain manufacturers, including Midwest. We believe this reflects a conflict of interest tied to Miss Wright's former employment. The board chair replied with controlled neutrality. The Ethics Committee has completed its review of your accusations. Their findings have been distributed to all involved parties. Victor accepted the thick packet handed to him, but continued speaking without opening it. Additionally, we've uncovered evidence that Miss Wright intentionally withheld crucial calibration documentation before her departure, making compliance needlessly difficult. It was a serious charge, one that could have damaged my professional standing if it held up. The board chair looked toward the Ethics Committee representative, who rose. That particular allegation was anticipated and examined thoroughly. Page 47 of our report addresses documentation practices at Midwest, during Miss Wright's tenure. Victor flipped to the page, his confidence slowly slipping into confusion. As you can see, the representative continued, Miss Wright maintained outstanding documentation standards. Her departure materials included 2,347 pages of technical documentation, 126 training videos, and comprehensive transition notes for each project. Compared to industry norms, this exceeds standard expectations by roughly 340%. This doesn't match our internal assessment, Victor insisted. Critical calibration sequences were missing. If I may, Xavier, our technical director, interjected. The committee reviewed the entire documentation package Miss Wright submitted. We found the calibration sequences fully detailed in Section 12.3, with cross-references to the implementation guides in Appendices E through G. Victor hurriedly consulted with his team. I watched his face redden as someone showed him something on a tablet. It appears, he said at last, that some documentation may have been misfiled internally after Miss Wright left, or possibly concealed, suggested a board member, to support this complaint. From that point, the meeting unraveled. Midwest's accusations collapsed under examination, each claim dismantled by evidence I had carefully prepared over 7 years. You see, my revenge was never about imposing impossible standards or targeting my former employer. It was about something far more powerful. Creating a system where the truth could not be buried, where contributions could not be stolen, and where excellence could not be exploited without recognition. For 7 years, I had documented everything, not just technical processes, but every instance where my ideas were appropriated, every email where credit was reassigned, every meeting where my contributions were minimized. I maintained dual records, the official documentation that met professional requirements, and my personal archive that told the true story of innovation at Midwest Manufacturing. When I joined the A, I didn't need to single out Midwest. I simply needed to build systems that would naturally expose what had been happening there all along. The attribution framework was the final piece, not to force Midwest to acknowledge me, that time had passed, but to prevent them from doing to others what they had done to me. 2 days after the failed complaint hearing, Midwest's board announced an internal investigation into potential misrepresentation by senior leadership regarding technical capabilities. Within a week, Victor and 2 other executives were placed on administrative leave. The Industry Oversight Board launched a separate inquiry into potential securities violations stemming from materially misleading statements about proprietary technologies, communications claiming ownership of innovations that were actually my uncredited work. 3 weeks later, as the investigations intensified, Diane appeared at my office, looking diminished without her executive armor. "The board asked me to come," she said bluntly. "We're facing serious consequences from the failed certification and the investigations. Our stock has dropped 60%. Eastbrook terminated their contract yesterday." I said nothing. "The board wants to negotiate," she continued. "They're prepared to offer public acknowledgement of your contributions, back pay for raises you should have received, and naming rights for the calibration method." "Why would I want any of that now?" I asked. "Because without it, Midwest won't survive another quarter," she admitted. 400 people will lose their jobs, not just leadership, engineers, and technicians, but people uninvolved in how you were treated. I considered her words carefully. The attribution framework offered a path forward for companies willing to honestly document their innovation history. Midwest could be among the first to adopt it. That would mean publicly admitting leadership took credit for work they didn't do, she said. "Yes," I replied simply. "It would mean telling the truth." She nodded slowly. "I'll take that to the board. But Penny, was this your plan all along?" I met her gaze directly. "My plan was to create an industry where innovation is properly attributed and excellence is properly valued. What's happening to Midwest is simply the natural consequence of years of decisions made by its leadership." The following month, Midwest Manufacturing became the fourth company to adopt the attribution framework. Their implementation included a public reconciliation of innovation credits, acknowledging 26 engineers whose contributions had previously been claimed as proprietary company methods. My name led the list with 17 distinct innovations spanning 7 years. Victor and 3 other executives resigned. The new CEO, promoted from engineering management, introduced a transparent compensation structure directly tied to innovation contributions. Jaime withdrew her ICA application and returned to Midwest to lead their attribution compliance team. 6 months later, Midwest achieved full certification under the new standards. Their stock stabilized, and while the Eastbrook contract was lost forever, new clients attracted by their ethical transformation filled much of the gap. At the next industry summit, I presented the final version of the attribution framework, now adopted by over 60% of certified manufacturers. As I concluded my presentation, I noticed a familiar face in the back row. Luis, my ex-boyfriend, now working for a competing certification body. Any questions? I asked the audience. Luis raised his hand. How do you respond to critics who say this framework primarily benefits individual innovators at the expense of corporate investment? I smiled. Innovation without attribution is appropriation. Companies that understand this attract the best talent, produce the best products, and ultimately deliver the best returns to investors. This isn't individuals versus corporations. It's about creating an ecosystem where excellence is recognized, rewarded, and therefore replicated. As the audience applauded, I thought about the envelope I had placed on the conference table a year earlier. The revenge wasn't in leaving Midwest. It wasn't even in exposing their practices. The true revenge was creating a world where what happened to me couldn't happen to anyone else. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. Have you ever had your contributions overlooked or appropriated? Share your experience in the comments below. Remember, recognition may be delayed, but excellence leaves evidence that eventually tells its own story.